Around the world, people look to California for leadership when it comes to clean energy and climate change. In 2006, we were one of the first states to pass aggressive climate change legislation, and our emissions have come down ever since. Last year, we passed legislation that requires that by 2030, we get half of our power from renewables. And our per capita energy consumption is some of the lowest in the United States. Now, I've been in California for 20 years, all of that time as an environmental activist, and 10 years of that as an energy analyst. And so I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that I never actually questioned any aspect of that story I just told you. All the facts I mentioned are correct, they just end up painting a really misleading story. So what do I mean? Well, we do get a lot of power from solar. Last year we got 10% of our electricity from solar, but it was actually more solar energy than we could use. This spring, we actually had to cut off the power from our solar farms so it wouldn't overwhelm the grid. Now, we've been adding more and more clean energy in aggregate terms, but you can see that since 1990, the percentage of power from clean energy sources has actually declined from 51% to 46%. What about emissions? Well, emissions did decline, as I mentioned, since 2000, but the interesting thing is they actually declined less than the national average. And I mentioned before the climate legislation in 2006. Well, here's the funniest part. Our emissions actually declined 4 times faster before we passed that climate legislation. Well, what about energy consumption? Well, the truth is that our low per capita energy consumption is a result of a couple of main factors. The first is just that our energy prices are much higher than the rest of the country, so our energy-intensive industries had to relocate elsewhere, things like manufacturing and factories. And then the other reason is that we live in a really temperate climate, and so we just don't need as much heating and air conditioning for our buildings and homes as other parts of the country. In other words, in California, we're not actually leading the clean energy revolution, we're losing it. Well, why is that? Well, to understand the reason, we have to go back in time, exactly 50 years, to a very special moment in American and I think in human history, and that's the rise of nuclear fear. Now, most people don't realize that in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of environmentalists were actually pro-nuclear. I mean, the Sierra Club argued for nuclear power plants as a way to not have to build hydroelectric dams, which require covering up a lot of the landscape, doing a lot of damage over a lot of areas. In 1966, there ended up being a really big debate inside the Sierra Club, which is a very powerful organization back then, really the main environmental organization in the state. And the debate was over whether or not to build a nuclear power plant just a half an hour away from here, Diablo Canyon. The most eloquent advocate for building Diablo Canyon was this man, Will Seary. He was a biophysicist at the University of California, Berkeley, and a member of the Sierra Club Board of Directors. He was also a pretty amazing mountaineer. Here he was in the Himalayas. He and his buddies almost starved to death in the Himalayas. Back then, you had to be a pretty badass mountaineer to be on the board of the Sierra Club. But Seary didn't just like nuclear power. Seary loved it. He wrote, "Nuclear power is one of the chief long-term hopes for conservation." What did he mean by that? Well, cheap, affordable, and abundant power, he argued, was essential to allow people to move to the cities, to get jobs in the cities. And that would allow the countryside to return to grasslands and forests for endangered species to come back. And if you're going to have all those people in the city and you're going to have all that power, it had to be clean. And if you didn't want to do hydroelectric dams anymore, you're really just left with one main alternative, and that was nuclear. Now, Seary had some very fierce opponents inside the Sierra Club. Maybe the most important one was this man, David Brower. He was the executive director of the Sierra Club, and he made the opposite argument to Seary. If a doubling of the state's population in the next 20 years is encouraged by providing the power resources for this growth, California's scenic character will be destroyed, he argued. In other words, the problem it's not about cities and countryside, it was just too many people coming to California. Well, a few years later, one of the Sierra Club's top advisors even went so far as to say, look, even if it's clean power, it doesn't matter. This is Amory Lovins, and he said, it'd be little short of disastrous for us to discover a source of clean, cheap, abundant energy because of what we would do with it. Now, you might be wondering what happened. Well, obviously you know that Diablo Canyon exists, but here's maybe the most surprising thing. In 1966, 1967, and then again in 1969, the Sierra Club Board of Directors and their membership voted in favor of Diablo Canyon, and support during that time actually grew. In the final vote, it was 3-1 in favor of building Diablo Canyon. Well, after this loss, David Brower left the Sierra Club in 1969. He founded a new organization called Friends of the Earth. He knew that he had to do something different than what they had done before to stop nuclear power. And he remembered back to 1962, when a young activist named David Pessinen came to him, and they worked out going to see a different nuclear power plant that was being proposed in Northern California. Here is David Pessinen and his friend Hazel Mitchell. David Pessinen came back to the Sierra Club Board of Directors, and he said, look, I think I can stop this plant, but we're not going to just do it with the conventional conservation arguments and tools. We're going to have to make a really different argument. We're going to have to argue that nuclear power plants are similar to nuclear weapons. And the Sierra Club Board of Directors was pretty upset by this. I mean, almost everybody on it was like not willing to go there. I mean, they all knew that nuclear power plant meltdowns could potentially be very bad, but they were not like nuclear bombs going off. Pessinen, though, was undeterred, and he actually ended up leaving the Sierra Club. And very shortly after, he and Hazel Mitchell produced a report that said that if this nuclear power plant went forward, it would create death dust, a kind of fallout that would poison the milk. And they organized local dairies, and in the process of doing that, they discovered an extraordinarily powerful invisible force, and that's the fear of mothers that their children might be poisoned. This finally affected the Sierra Club as a whole. By 1974, the head of the Sierra Club was saying, our campaign stressing the hazards of nuclear power will supply a rationale for increasing regulation and add to the cost of the industry. This is from an internal strategy document. In 5 years, David Brower's fear-based strategy had done outside the Sierra Club what he had failed to do inside of it, and that was to make the organization and really the rest of the environmental movement anti-nuclear. Now, the Sierra Club at the time found a strong ally in the young new governor of California, Jerry Brown. And between 1975 and 1978, they would kill 2 major nuclear power plants with multiple reactors on them. David Pessinen had a ballot initiative that was in the works, and Jerry Brown used that to pass the legislation that effectively outlawed nuclear power, with the exception of nuclear power plants already under construction, including Diablo Canyon. Here's later, when one of the historians came back and was asking questions about what went on with anti-nuclear activists, he interviewed this man, Martin Litton, who was one of the first ones to photograph Diablo Canyon from the sky. And he asked Martin, he said, how worried were you actually about meltdowns? Martin said, I really didn't care about possible nuclear accidents because there are too many people anyway. I think that playing dirty if you have a noble end is fine. At the time, Jerry Brown had 2 very close political allies. The first is a very famous Hollywood actress named Jane Fonda. There she's in the middle, and her husband, Tom Hayden, on the right. And in 1978, Jane was approached by the actor Michael Douglas with a screenplay. He said, you might be interested in this. She was very interested in it. In the next year, in 1979, this film came out, The China Syndrome. The China Syndrome is a political thriller about a nuclear power plant that almost melts down due to corporate greed and corruption. The plant itself looks eerily similar to Diablo Canyon. There's an earthquake. You get the idea. The name of the film actually came from a kind of outlandish scenario. The idea was that if there were a meltdown, the hot melted nuclear fuel would melt all the way through the earth to China. There was a... You can see where I'm going. There's a couple of problems with this. The first is that China's not actually on the other side of the earth from California. It's actually much closer to Madagascar, but I don't think Madagascar syndrome did well in focus groups. The second problem is that that's just physically impossible. That's just not what nuclear fuels can do. But Jane Fonda tapped into the same thing that David Pessinen had discovered 17 years earlier, which is the fears of mothers. And so there's an extraordinary moment in the middle of the film when it sort of breaks out of a normal feature film into something approaching a documentary, where she shows ordinary mothers becoming politically active to stop a nuclear power plant. Well, here's the plot twist. Just 12 days after China Syndrome comes out in the theaters, there really is a nuclear power plant meltdown. It's at a nuclear plant called 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. One of the reactors melted, and very quickly after this, Jane Fonda and her husband Tom Hayden and Jerry Brown and a set of other folks said, this is a major opportunity. And so they organized a series of rock concerts with just the biggest stars of the day, no nukes. And you can see they're doing the same thing in this poster that David Pessinen wanted to do in 1962, which is to tie together nuclear power plants with nuclear bombs. You can see the mushroom cloud in the background. And on stage at the first concert in Washington, D.C., they actually put on stage a former soldier who had been wounded during a nuclear bomb test right before they put on stage a pregnant mom who was worried about the impacts of 3 Mile Island. The film had an extraordinary effect on how the media covered 3 Mile Island. I mean, the screenwriter for the film actually said that New York Daily News editor, after he heard about the meltdown, stood up and said, "Who here has seen China Syndrome? You're assigned to cover the meltdown." The film is about what could have happened. There's not actually a meltdown in it. It's the fear of a meltdown happening. But here we had a full meltdown, and the coverage was very similar. It was about what could have happened. Well, part of the reason for that is that really nothing did. I mean, you had a full reactor meltdown, and there was no harmful levels of radiation released. If you were standing near the plant at the time, you would have gotten less radiation than you get from an X-ray. The 2 million people in the surrounding area got something on average of like 1/6 of a chest X-ray. So it didn't actually have to do with what happened. It was having to do with what we imagined, and the imaginary of the nuclear weapons was tied up with that. Several months later, a few miles away from here, the governor came, and they spoke at the No Nukes concert against Diablo Canyon. He got a standing ovation for a minute afterwards, and he led the crowd in chanting, "No on Diablo, no on Diablo." Now, at the time, Jerry Brown and the Sierra Club and other anti-nuclear groups said that we didn't need nuclear power because we could use energy efficiency and just reduce how much electricity we consumed. And to the extent to which there was still some need for power, we could meet it with solar panels and wind turbines. That was what was happening publicly. But behind the scenes, something different was happening. The Sierra Club and Jerry Brown were working closely with a coal company to build a coal plant. The same historian went back and interviewed all the key actors at the time. The governor said, "I want the Department of Water Resources to build a coal plant." So we embarked on the planning of a coal plant, a dreadful prospect. Even back in the 1950s and 60s, people still understood that coal was our dirtiest fossil fuel. Well, you can see what happens. If you just total up all of the nuclear reactors that were going to be built but were killed by Jerry Brown and his allies, today we would be getting 88% of our power from clean energy resources. Instead, we're getting just 46%. And you can see the impact on emissions. They're twice as high as they would have been had we built out all that nuclear. Jerry Brown was reelected for a third term in office in 2010. And as soon as he came in, he and his allies in and outside the administration had their eyes set on closing San Onofre and on Diablo Canyon. And they did that through a series of measures, both regulatory and legislative. And I mentioned before that emissions went up, or the emissions declined faster before 2006 than they did after. Well, the reason for that is the closure of our second to last nuclear power plant, San Onofre. You can see that emissions had been declining from 2000 to 2010. From 2011 to 2014, they went up. All of this starts to challenge the idea that you don't need nuclear power to reduce emissions or substitute for fossil fuels. And that's not a particularly new idea. One of the most humanitarian members of the Sierra Club board, also happened to be one of our greatest photographers at the time, had it just right. Nuclear energy is the only practical alternative that we have to destroying the environment with oil and coal. In 2014, I finally visited Diablo Canyon. The misinformation campaign, the fear really had worked on me. When I was like 12 or 13, I still remember, it was maybe my first time I ever thought about nuclear power. My sister told me that they had been building a nuclear power plant in California near earthquake faults. And I immediately thought that if there was an earthquake in California, it would be like a nuclear bomb going off. I didn't believe that by the time I was at Diablo Canyon in 2014. And I knew that it wasn't producing air or water pollution, but I wasn't prepared for just the absolutely spectacular sight that I saw. That, by the way, actually is a humpback whale breaching out of the water. I swear to God I didn't Photoshop that in before this talk. That plant sits on about 4 football fields of land, an extraordinarily small amount of land, and it produces power for 3 million Californians. One of the state's top marine biologists, a man at the University of California, Santa Cruz, published a report, an extraordinary thing that jumped out at me. He said the tide pools around Diablo Canyon are some of the most pristine on the West Coast. And the reason is really easy to understand why. They don't allow school bus loads of school children to go tromping around on the tide pools and touching the anemones and grabbing the starfish. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love taking my kids to the tide pools, but they cause more damage to them than a nuclear power plant. After seeing this, I felt like it wouldn't be fair for this just to be to just see one of what I think is one of the great nuclear power plants in the world. I needed to also see one of the worst. And so I decided to go to Fukushima, and I interviewed everybody that I could. And one of the people that was the most critical is a guy who has spent a lot of his career investigating nuclear power plants in Japan, sort of a probability risk assessor. And he sort of hated everything. That's why I loved him. And he wrote the most scathing report about Fukushima, and so of course I wanted to spend time with him. And I had a little bit of trepidation when we were drinking beers, and I asked him, what did he think of Diablo Canyon? I mean, everyone's worried that it'll be something like Fukushima over there. And he just, without missing a beat, he just goes, "That's a great plant." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And he goes, "Because the people there care." And it just struck me that it didn't have anything to do with like the kind of machinery or where it was located. It was about the people, and it was about the culture. And I started to wonder, is this something that we could actually tell people, that people would start to understand? Diablo Canyon is now supposed to be closed by 2024, 2025. I've been traveling around the country for the last 10 months, raising awareness that the fact that we could actually end up losing half of our nuclear power before 2030. If that happens, then half of the emissions reductions that we're supposed to get from the EPA's Clean Power Plan won't happen. That's not to mention the asthma and the premature death from just the regular pollution. So I've been working with the climate scientist James Hansen. Here we are in Illinois visiting a couple plants that could be closed. And it was very nice. The Wall Street Journal ended up writing a story about our visit. And then that night, we got a little boost of support from another really famous Hollywood actor, Robert Downey Jr. He said, "It's like half the people who were saying no nukes are now realizing nuclear is the best way to go for energy for the future. I think it's natural to re-examine your beliefs as you age up." And I thought back when he said this to my own experience. I mean, you have to have a reason to rethink your beliefs. Mine was I was concerned about climate change, and I couldn't figure out how you double or triple or even quadruple global electricity production so that everybody can be lifted out of poverty while still reducing our emissions for climate change. And I started to wonder, is this how nuclear fear ends as we start to care and as we start to age up? In the process of trying to save Diablo, I met 2 really amazing women, Heather Madison and Kristen Zaitz. They reached out to me and they said, "How can we help?" And I asked them, "Well, what do you want to do?" And they said, "We want to talk to Sierra Club members and parents who also are concerned about the same things we are, about pollution and their kids." And so they started something called Mothers for Nuclear. And the focus has really been both on climate change, but also on just the ordinary air pollution impacts of nuclear power. And, as we've reflected on it some more, well, I don't think it's ever justified what they did when they tried to link nuclear power to nuclear weapons. I think it's understandable that in the 1960s and the 1970s, people had some concerns about this totally new source of electricity. I mean, we didn't have a lot of information about what would happen, and there were some reasons to be fearful of it. But today we have over 50 years of data that all show the same thing. Nuclear is the safest way to make reliable power. This is just the most recent study from the British medical journal Lancet, and you can see that most of the deaths are actually from air pollution, and that's why nuclear is the safest. Even when you look at the accidents, we see that the accidents result in fewer deaths from nuclear than it does for these other energy sources. And if you just take a rough estimate of using the Lancet numbers to look at Diablo Canyon, what you find is that if Diablo is closed early, it could result in over 5,000 premature deaths. And reflect on that for a moment, that our fears of this way of making electricity are actually putting us at risk. They're putting our children at risk, and the people that are the most affected are poorer communities that live near fossil fuel generators. So after Mothers for Nuclear had this big impact on NPR News and listened to around the world, I started to wonder, maybe it'll be that nuclear fear ends the same way that it begins, with the concern of mothers for their children. At the end of June, Mothers for Nuclear and my organization, Environmental Progress, we decided to have a march to speak out and defend nuclear power in general and Diablo Canyon in particular. And so we marched through the streets of San Francisco. There was about 100 of us. It was one of the most joyful experiences of my life. We were singing and chanting. I couldn't believe there were that many people that agreed with us. There was a friend of mine, Gwyneth Cravens, who wrote a beautiful book about nuclear power about 10 years ago, is also a pretty famous novelist, writes for The New Yorker. She agreed to do civil disobedience with me, and so we sat in at Greenpeace, Sierra Club, and NRDC. And when we were sitting there, a bunch of students from UC Berkeley, of course, sort of spontaneously decided to sit with us. And then once the students sat down, of course, everybody else wanted to sit down, all flashing the V sign. I thought to myself, is this how nuclear fear ends? Where the students come first and then everybody else follows? There was a very sweet moment at the end where two of my friends from Australia, who are just beautiful people, and we had just been up swimming in the river with their kids, their daughter just ran out of the crowd into my lap. That's Abby right there, 5 years old. She wanted to be a part of the singing. She wanted to be a part of the joy of it. And I have such mixed emotions about it still. There was a time when everybody was sort of staring at us, and there was this crowd, and people were both smiling, and I was happy, but I looked up, and there was Heather just on the edge of the crowd, and she was smiling too, but her eyes were wide, and they were red, and they were starting to fill with water. And it just struck to me right then that we're going to overcome these irrational fears by tapping into an invisible force that's more powerful than fear, and that's love. Thank you very much.